Theosophical from our heart to yours, love.
So last time I was here with a good friend of yours and mine, Betty Bland. And so that worked out very, very well. That was actually the first time I had ever visited with your group. Now this is the second. So once again, it's great to be back. Obviously, I had given a title for the evening's presentation just because I think that's sort of what you do. But then again, knowing that I was coming to San Francisco, I also know that that's not what you do. That there's things I want to talk about. And probably it's easiest for me just to think in terms of just sharing what might be on my mind at the moment. A lot of things going on, obviously, in the world, but this is the Theosophical Society. So in many respects, the focus tends to be, oftentimes it tends to be more focused on the, you could say, the inner world. There's climate change, but what's going on with the inner climate? So that's this idea of what is the present need. Because obviously, it seems as if one of the things that strikes me as being a little bit clear at the moment is that there, no matter what a person's individual beliefs might be, or no matter what your particular background might be, that probably there is nobody that you're going to run into who does not have the sense that there is something going on in the world that needs some level of deeper response than seems to be provided through the normal channels. And so the question then becomes, what is that? And is it something that we have a role in addressing or not? And if we come down on the side of no, basically we are powerless to address the things that are happening around us, then you conduct your life in a certain way. And that's fine. If you come down on the side that yes, in fact, there is some sort of process that is going on in which I am engaged, and therefore there is a certain potency that is within my own power, then you live your life and conduct yourself in another way. So, the important thing really is not so much what the problems are and what our opinion of those problems may be. Perhaps the more important thing is to arrive at some sort of conclusion for yourself as to whether or not there are choices that can be made that are within your power. And really, because this is the perspective that is generally described as one that is the theosophical perspective, the ageless wisdom perspective. Generally, it's something that focuses on what we tend to speak of as the spiritual dimension. I've often come to think that that's a word that's getting a little bit too much use, in the sense that it's becoming so used that it starts to get a little bit vague. When you talk about spiritual, so many people are mouthing that word in so many different contexts. What does it mean? Is it what happens in church on Sunday? Is it what happens when you sit and listen to Deepak Chopra? What is it? I tell this, I thought I was joking. And I would say things like, this word spiritual is getting used so much these days that I won't be surprised if it turns into a marketing phrase, where it's used to sell gym shoes or spiritual gym shoes, spiritual yoga mats, So I joked. I thought I joked. Until what happened was, one particular day, Lily and I were out for a drive in Chicago. And, probably it's a lot like San Francisco. where you have different areas, and if you don't drive around the city often, you'll come through a particular area and it's changed. And generally what the change means is that it's become gentrified, and you've got coffee shops you didn't know were there before. We were coming through one of these areas, hadn't been there in a few years. And I happened to look out the window of the car, and a sign in front of one of these stores was there. And I told Lily, I said, will you look at that? It's happened. Because the store was called the Spiritual Boutique. I couldn't make that up. It was the Spiritual Boutique, and they had jewelry that was spiritual. They had, yoga outfits that were spiritual. They had, everything in the clothing line you could ask for. But it had become a marketing term. So, I find that when I use that word, perhaps it needs a little bit further clarification sometimes. So when I talk about that which is spiritual, actually I'm starting to use the word less and less. I start to prefer really to talk about consciousness, because it doesn't have like a religious overtone. But spiritual, what is it that is spiritual? That which is spiritual is that which moves toward the perception of oneness, of unity. So anything that moves us toward a deeper realization that life functions as one whole, that it is not divided in any of the sorts of ways that we have come to be used to seeing the world. Anything that takes us into that sort of realm has this spiritual quality. And so what I've been seeing really is that it's nothing new, but it does seem as if there is something of a disconnect between what we would regard as that which is spiritual and that which we regard as the material world. That somehow or another there's this or there's that, and never the two shall meet. And I think for a lot of people that's sort of a problem. And it creates problems in terms of once you start to find that there is some sort of a deeper avenue of perception, or if you have some sort of practice, whether it's meditation practice, prayer, whatever it is that you do, but something in which you start to have experiences of something more profound, some sense of connection to something deeper, some sort of sense of peace in which the normal sort of boundaries that we find ourselves living within dissolve somewhat. Then you start to move into this realm that we would call spiritual. But then how do you link that to the day-to-day life that we live? And that's where the problem tends to come in. One of the great spiritual teachers of the past made the comment, when asked, what is a human being? The way that the human being was described was as highest spirit and lowest matter linked by mind. It's a simple way of describing it. Very highest spiritual unfoldment, highest spiritual states, densest matter linked by the mind is a description of what a human being is. And so to me, that's something that, it's a very simple way of describing things, but it's also something that gives you, it points in a direction. It describes where it is that the work that we have to do needs to be done. And really it's all in this realm of the mind, the linking ground between the spirit and between matter is where our work lies. So really, part of the thing that we find ourselves faced with is how to first understand what this mind is. One of the problems that we have, as I said, everybody looks around and there's nobody who is not aware that there's a lot of things going on in the world. And a lot of what we look at falls into that category of problems and crises. I mean, if you look at the world today, you could probably make a better list than me, but anybody who is just mildly aware, just a newspaper reader or a news watcher, knows that some of the things that are facing us right now are very severe and very imminent. I mean, you look at it all around the world, deserts are growing where there used to be fertile land, and they're growing at this alarming rate. It's just spreading. We are always hearing about the effect that humanity is having on the air, the water, the land. The oceans are being fished to a degree where it's at a certain point it might be fished beyond its ability to recover. Mass extinctions, the list goes on, and let's not even talk climate change. 78 degrees today in San Francisco. I don't know if that's normal. But anyway, so you've got all of these things, and everybody's aware of it, and the problem becomes this. There's a quote that I'll share with you. You've probably heard it already. And I think sometimes, it's a quote from Albert Einstein. And I think sometimes as a speaker, it doesn't hurt to quote Einstein because it gives that sort of luster of a deeper understanding. But Albert Einstein and others made this statement that no problem can be solved on the level of consciousness at which it was created. You've heard it before. There is no problem that can be solved on the level of consciousness that created that problem. So, you have the example. An example I find myself using frequently. In the world today, right now, according to the UN, you've got 64 different wars going on around the planet. 64 places where people are fighting each other, killing each other, organized sorts of warfare. One of the remarkable statistics as well is that in these 64 wars, I don't understand this one, but somehow or another there are over 600 groups that are involved in these wars. So it's like 10 per war. It's confusing to me because how do they even know who they're shooting at when it's just 10 groups per war? But these are the facts. So when you look at it, war is something that's been with us for a long time. And just in terms of the consciousness that functions in the mode where war is an acceptable sort of alternative, what is the response where there is violence in the world? And I think we know what it is. When violence arises, the mind that creates these sorts of conditions responds by applying a greater level of violence. The only way to stop a war is with a greater force. And that's how we've been doing it for millennia. And does it work? And the examples that I see would tend to say no. I mean, the slogan for World War I was supposed to be, the justification for fighting this war was this was going to be the war that would end all wars. And within 30 years, it was World War II, and it's been nonstop ever since. So the consciousness that creates this sort of sense that violence is acceptable and effective is not the consciousness that has been able to solve this sort of problem. And one of the things that's quite remarkable is when you look at this whole list of things, whether it's pollution of the atmosphere, the land, actually there are answers to every single one of those problems. They exist now. We don't have to come up with another invention. It doesn't require a new theory. It's here. The knowledge that is available to us now is sufficient to address every single one of these problems. So if that's the case, then probably we should ask ourselves another question. Now, if that's true, and I believe it is, then why haven't the problems been addressed? Why hasn't it been solved? And what it tells me is that really, in a certain sense, part of the problem that we're facing is that really knowledge in and of itself is not enough. There is no particular theory. There is no knowledge base that's sufficient to address these things. It requires something more profound, something that Lula might know, but that the rest of us are missing out on. But what is it? What is that something that goes beyond mere knowledge? And this is one of the beauties of this ageless wisdom tradition. This is one of the beauties of this teaching that speaks, it was called Theosophy. That one of the main things that it speaks about is something that we really already know, which is that, first of all, as human beings, we are multi-dimensional beings. We function on many, many levels. The level of the physical body being just one of those. The level of the mind even being just one of those. But that there is this spectrum of consciousness that functions within us continually, but for whatever reason, we've kind of dumbed it down to where we are only available of just only the slightest bandwidth of that is available to us. And so how do we access that other part? There's really sort of this idea of what is this, what is the need of the moment? And what is it that we can do about this need? There was a fellow by the name of A.P. Sinnett. This is years ago. And he made a comment. He wrote a number of books. He wrote one book called Esoteric Buddhism. And I think it was in that book that he said, he talked about the traditional ways of teaching. So these teachers who focused on the unfoldment of consciousness, how was it that they taught? And so what he said was that the traditional method was, it wasn't just something where you picked up a book and you read it, you had somebody get you to repeat it to them accurately, and you had learned it, which is the way that we tend to approach learning. But that it was a very different sort of way that it was taught. And I'll tell you, and maybe it'll make sense to you. What he said was that the traditional method of these teachers was that every fresh idea was impressed on the mind by, this is the part I like, by provoking the perplexity which that truth would at last relieve. So basically, it was by creation of internal crises that as we came to understand something about the deeper nature of consciousness, that would be resolved. I mean, when you think about it, I just look at myself, and the times that I could say were the most profound learning experiences almost universally have been times of crisis. You know, the moments where I think everybody deepened tend to be moments of loss, illness, various sorts of challenges that you find come across your way. And in those moments are the times that you wouldn't ask for that experience ever again. But when you look back, those seem to be the times that the greatest was called out of us. And in order to address this problem of the moment, something had to come up out of us. We had to do something to relieve this perplexity that's created. The thing that we have going now, at least the way I'm seeing it, is that, you know, really we're sort of facing as a human family a time when there is this global perplexity, this global sort of crisis, multiple crises, that somehow or another we're going to have to learn how to address, how to respond to. And until we get that right, not only is it not going to go away, but it's certainly going to, the level of it is certain to increase. So, you know, what is it that is beyond the sort of knowledge that has brought these various problems into being? So in the spiritual traditions of the world, what they tend to focus on, depending on what tradition you talk about, in the Christian tradition, there would be the example of the what's sometimes spoken of as the still small voice. You know, that within the consciousness of every human being, there is this higher way of knowing, more profound way of knowing, that seems to always be whispering, but generally is drowned out because our focus is on, you know, much more the loud callings of the demands of the body and what we have to do for work and all those sorts of things, so that this voice never really gets heard properly. In the Theosophical tradition, they speak about buddhi, or the intuitive faculty, not intuition that's hunches or gut feelings, but that perception that's able to see a connection with a greater life, that is always speaking to us and speaking through us, but we don't hear it. Now, this is something, Theosophical Society came into being in 1875, as Mary described. It had 3 objects. Really only one of them was something that was said that needs to be the focus of anyone who joins the organization. The 3 objects were to form a nucleus of the universal brotherhood of humanity. That was the first one. Without regard to caste, religion, sex, gender, any of the things that we have sort of determined divide us. So the idea of unity was the first one. And then there was the comparative study of religion, science, philosophy. Basically, that all of the avenues that we pursue toward truth have a common thread. You know, they speak about fingers pointing at the moon. That, you know, 1 million people are pointing. There are 1 million ways that you can point toward it, but really it's the moon that's the focus. So, science, philosophy, religion, all of them are avenues that point toward this one common denominator. And then there was the idea that there are powers latent in the human being that are unexplored, unexplained, and that are latent within all of us. So that was the sort of realm that was the basis for the founding of the TS. So the simple idea of the unity of the human family was the real central focus. And it's one of those ideas that in 1875, when the Theosophical Society was founded, was something that was, was revolutionary. This was colonial times in India, and there was not equality, there was not unity. Now, of course, it's a basis for the United Nations and for every nation in the world. This is a fact of life. But it's an idea that's based not just on this, what we've come to regard, brotherhood as based in civil rights. That it's something that is, it's the nature of governments to enforce. It's based on the sense that there is one life that animates all beings, and that's the basis for this